The New Enlightenment, A Vision for Global Renaissance Part 1. Flaws in Current Systems Chapter 1. The Hidden Rot, Corruption, Conflicts, and the Crisis of Trust in the Grand Halls of Power. A silent plague thrives. Whispers of deals struck in shadowy corners, of fortunes lining the pockets of the self-serving, of decisions warped to favor the few over the many. This is the reality of corruption and conflicts of interest. They are the insidious diseases that weaken the foundations of even the most seemingly robust societies. Bribery, the vile exchange of currency for unjust advantage, leaves a trail of tarnished reputations and broken systems. Embezzlement by those entrusted with public funds amounts to a direct betrayal of the people, a siphoning off of resources meant for the common good. Nepotism, the elevation of family and friends over merit, breeds resentment and stifles true potential. Special interests sway the hands of government with promises of wealth and power, leaving the public interest trampled in their wake. The specter of conflicts of interest lurks wherever private motives entangle with public obligations. Laws and regulations meant to safeguard impartiality are too often riddled with loopholes or poorly enforced. A dearth of transparency in financial dealings and ethical conduct shields wrongdoing from scrutiny. Companies and individuals with deep pockets find ways to purchase influence rather than compete on a level playing field. The revolving door swings with dizzying speed between positions in government and lucrative lobbying roles, the boundaries between self-interest and public service hopelessly blurred. This fuels the perception that those in power create rules they themselves are never truly subject to. Even the institutions tasked with regulating entire industries fall prey to regulatory capture, transformed into toothless guardians by the very entities they are meant to oversee. The consequences of this unchecked corruption are profound. Public trust in institutions erodes, replaced by cynicism and the belief that the entire system is rigged. Participation in the democratic process wanes as disillusioned citizens conclude their voices count for little against the bought and paid for influence of the corrupt. Economic growth is stunted as a climate of uncertainty and unfair competition discourages innovation and investment. Worst of all, the gap between rich and poor widens, fueled by insider deals that unjustly enrich the few, leaving the most vulnerable to struggle without a safety net. Like termites gnawing at the beams of a once grand house, corruption and conflicts of interest hollow out societies from within. Their unchecked spread does not simply lead to individual acts of malfeasance, but to a pervasive rot that threatens the very core of democracy and undermines the promise of progress. Yet, in even the darkest of times, a glimmer of hope remains. The fight against corruption is one that must be waged with unwavering resolve. This battleground is not only in the courts and legislatures, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens. It is through a renewed commitment to transparency, through an unyielding demand for accountability, and through a strengthening of ethical foundations that the destructive forces of corruption and conflicts of interest can be held at bay. The New Enlightenment, if it is to be worthy of the name, must prioritize this fight. We can draw inspiration from the great reformers of the past, individuals who railed against entrenched corruption in their own times. Their legacy reminds us that progress, though arduous, is possible. This chapter has only scratched the surface of a multifaceted issue. In the following pages, we will delve deeper, exploring concrete examples of how corruption and conflict of interest manifest in different spheres of society. We will examine the tools and strategies that can be employed to combat them, from robust investigative journalism to empowering citizen oversight. And we will spotlight those who are leading the charge for reform, their tireless efforts proving that even in the face of entrenched power, the fight for a more just and ethical world can and must be won. Chapter 2. The Unheard Voices. Systemic barriers and the fight for true representation. A fundamental promise of democracy lies in the ideal that the people, in their rich diversity, hold a genuine stake in shaping their own destiny. Yet, for far too many, this promise remains unfulfilled. The lack of representation for racial, ethnic, and gender minorities stands as a glaring contradiction to the principles of equality and inclusion that form a nation's bedrock. The numbers tell a stark story. In legislatures, boardrooms, and positions of power across society, the faces of minority groups are too often absent. Systemic barriers, some overt and others insidious, limit their ability to claim their rightful place in shaping the world around them. Gerrymandering, the strategic manipulation of electoral districts, dilutes the political power of minority communities. Voter suppression tactics, veiled under the guise of security measures, disproportionately target marginalized groups, erecting obstacles to their participation in the democratic process. The hard-won victories of the past are under attack. Rollbacks in affirmative action policies that sought to level the playing field are stripping away opportunities for education and advancement. Discrimination, both subtle and blatant, persists in the workplace, limiting economic opportunity and perpetuating cycles of disadvantage. Issues uniquely impacting minority communities often receive scant attention, their concerns relegated to the sidelines of the national discourse. This lack of representation reverberates through society. In too many of the institutions meant to serve and protect all citizens, a lack of diversity within the workforce and leadership leads to blind spots, biases, and a failure to understand the lived experiences of those from minority backgrounds. The results of this disconnect are devastating. Deep disparities in education, where minority students too often find themselves with fewer resources and lower expectations. Inequalities in housing, where segregation and discriminatory practices persist, and a criminal justice system where racial bias contributes to disproportionately harsh outcomes for minority individuals. The corrosive effects of underrepresentation extend far beyond individual lives. When entire segments of the population feel shut out of the decision-making processes that shape their communities and their nation, it breeds disillusionment and distrust. The phrase, taxation without representation, echoes across centuries, a haunting reminder that when people lack a meaningful voice in their own governance, the very foundations of a just society are undermined. Yet, amidst these challenges, the spirit of resistance burns bright. From grassroots movements to courtroom battles, those who have been marginalized for too long are raising their voices and demanding change. The fight for true representation requires a multifaceted approach. Dismantling discriminatory practices and voter suppression tactics is essential to ensure that the democratic process is fair and accessible to all. Increasing diversity at all levels of government, business, and civil society is not simply a matter of tokenism, but of ensuring that decisions and policies reflect the needs and perspectives of the entire population. This means investing in programs that support minority leadership development and actively addressing the systemic barriers that hold so many back. The new Enlightenment must embrace a vision of representation that goes beyond simple inclusion. It must acknowledge the historical injustices that have created deep inequalities and actively work to dismantle the structures that perpetuate them. This will require uncomfortable conversations, a willingness to listen to voices long ignored, and a steadfast commitment to building a society where opportunity and justice are not determined by race, ethnicity, or gender identity. True representation is not simply a goal, it is an ongoing process. It demands that we remain vigilant against attempts to roll back progress and that we continue to push for a more inclusive and equitable world. The voices of the marginalized hold within them the wisdom, resilience, and innovation that can guide us towards a brighter future. In a world where diversity is celebrated and all voices are truly heard, we unlock the full potential of human possibility. Chapter 3. The Rise of the New Aristocracy. Wealth, power, and the distortion of democracy. The chasm of wealth inequality yawns ever wider, threatening to swallow whole the promise of a society where opportunity is bound by ambition, not birthright. A stark reality has emerged. A shocking concentration of wealth resides in the hands of a select few, while the vast majority struggle to make ends meet. The new Enlightenment must confront this insidious force that undermines the very foundation of progress and erodes the heart of any genuine democracy. The numbers paint a damning picture. A tiny sliver of the population, the top 1%, commands a staggering share of the nation's wealth. This is no mere disparity. It is a level of economic stratification akin to the Gilded Age, casting a long shadow over the ideals of a meritocratic society. Economic mobility, once a cherished part of the American dream, has stalled or gone into reverse for many. The rungs on the ladder of opportunity seem ever further apart, leaving those at the bottom feeling increasingly trapped. The consequences of such extreme inequality reverberate through every aspect of our society. The outsized influence of the wealthy elite bends the political system to its will. Generous campaign contributions to candidates aligned with their interests are a common currency. Powerful lobbying groups advocate relentlessly for policies that favor the already privileged, often at the expense of the common good. Meanwhile, the ultra-rich utilize sophisticated tax avoidance strategies and offshore havens to shield their fortunes from contributing their fair share, further eroding the resources needed to fund essential public services. The result is a system that increasingly appears rigged. Public perception hardens into cynicism, the belief that the government serves not the many, but the desires of the wealthy few. The erosion of political equality, a core democratic principle, is a chilling prospect. When policy is shaped by the size of a donor's checkbook rather than the value of one's vote, the very foundations of our system of governance tremble. Wealth inequality does not exist in a vacuum. It feeds into and exacerbates other societal ills. When children born into poverty see few pathways to escape their circumstances, potential is squandered and resentment festers. As economic insecurity gnaws at the middle class, populist anger and divisive rhetoric find fertile ground. Communities starved of investment crumble. The great promise of equality of opportunity, the bedrock upon which our nation was built, withers away. Yet, in confronting this challenge, we must avoid the pitfall of begrudging the success of those who have achieved wealth through legitimate means. The goal should not be to tear down the successful but to lift up those left behind and establish a system where hard work and talent have a fair chance to thrive. It is vital to remember that a more equitable society benefits us all. A robust middle class serves as the engine of economic growth, and when everyone has a stake in the system, social cohesion and trust are strengthened. The new Enlightenment must champion policies that combat the toxic influence of extreme wealth inequality. This includes reforming campaign finance laws to reduce the corrosive impact of big money in politics, closing tax loopholes that allow the ultra-wealthy to escape their obligations, and investing in quality education, economic mobility programs, and a robust social safety net that provides a floor beneath which no one should fall. Crucially, we must also reclaim a sense of civic virtue. Billionaires should understand that the vast wealth comes with social responsibility, a responsibility to ensure their employees are fairly compensated, a responsibility to contribute to the communities where they live and work, and a responsibility to participate in the democratic process on the same level playing field as all other citizens. The battle against wealth inequality is one that will define our times. It is a fight for the very soul of our democracy and the promise of a better future for all. Let the new Enlightenment be defined by its resolve to create a society where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential, regardless of their family's fortune or zip code.